Hello and welcome back to the Fall of the Roman Empire. My name is Nick Holmes and this is episode 30 called Julian in Gaul. In the last episode we heard about Constantius II's struggle to maintain the empire's unity, fighting the rebellion of the Roman general Magnentius in the west while also dealing with a hostile Persia in the east. Fortunately for Constantius, the Persian front went quiet in AD 350, allowing him to crush Magnentius. But the upshot of Magnentius's rebellion was that Constantius became understandably terrified of other rebellions in those parts of the empire where he wasn't personally resident. Indeed, as you heard in the last episode, when he left to fight Magnentius in the west, he had put his cousin Gallus in charge in the east, hoping to make sure that no army officers or anyone else decided that they'd like to have a go at being emperor. But as you know from the last episode, Gallus proved supremely unfit for high office and was so corrupt that Constantius had to arrest and execute him. As I also said in the last episode, Constantius was no Diocletian, and he was unable to rule the empire using a system like the Tetrarchy. What he preferred was to appoint his relatives to senior positions, as he'd done with Gallus. But there were two difficulties with this. First, the relative might not be up to the job, like Gallus. And second, Constantius had, unfortunately, killed most of his relatives back in 337, in the infamous Massacre of the Princes, when he eliminated all of his immediate rivals except for his two brothers and two very young cousins. So that meant that after he executed Gallus, there was only one male relative left, a young man of 24 called Julian. Now, as I think you know, this young man would become one of Rome's most controversial emperors, famous for attempting to put the clock back on Christianity, for which he would earn the name Julian the Apostate, but also a very important military leader, responsible for a great victory over the Germans in the west, but then a great disaster against the Persians in the east. So, in his short reign, a lot happened. Now, let's start in AD 337, when Julian was only 6 years old. That was the year, of course, of Constantine the Great's death, and the year of the Massacre of the Princes, as I just mentioned, when Constantius executed most of his relatives. And for the young Julian, this was pretty dreadful, since one of those he executed was Julian's own father, Julius Constantius, who was Constantine the Great's half-brother. Since Julian's mother had died in childbirth, this left him parentless, and he was put in the hands of his maternal grandmother. Now, you may well ask, why was he allowed to survive the slaughter of most of his relatives in the first place? Well, as I mentioned in episode 27, aside from Constantine's 3 sons who carved the empire up between them, 2 relatives did survive, and these were Julian and his half-brother Gallus. And the reason, I think, was probably a sense of remorse on Constantius's part, since they were both children, Gallus being only 11 years old and Julian, as I mentioned, 6. So it seems, against all expectations, even Constantius had a conscience. Julian's childhood was quiet and secluded, living in Bithynia, where he spent most of his time reading. However, it soon became clear that he was a very intelligent and bookish young man, who later described himself, quote, "Some men have a passion for horses, others for birds, others again for wild beasts, but I, from childhood, have been infused with a passionate longing to acquire books." End quote. And the books that he read were to have a profound effect on him, for while in his early childhood they were predominantly Christian texts, shown him by his personal tutor Eusebius, the Bishop of Nicomedia, he also managed to read many of the great classical texts, including Homer, helped by another tutor called Mardonius. These were the works that meant the most to him, and he developed a fascination and love for ancient Greek and Roman civilization. In contrast, he found the Christian teachings shallow. We must remember that one good reason for his hostility to Christianity was that he probably felt oppressed by it. Not only was the new religion becoming ever more aggressive in its attacks on the ancient pagan world, but it was also the religion of his uncle, Constantius II. And as you know, Constantius had murdered Julian's father and most of his relatives. Now, that's not exactly very Christian behaviour. And later in his life, Julian denounced it as a hideous crime. It certainly must have made his uncle's Christian devotion seem pretty hypocritical to Julian. Therefore, it's really little wonder that Julian found Christianity hard to stomach. But one thing is for sure, anyone who saw him when he was a teenager would certainly not have predicted that he would end up becoming one of the most celebrated and controversial of all Roman emperors. Now, Julian himself says that his bookishness and introversion when he was growing up was because he was forced to spend his teenage years in virtual solitary confinement. Constantius was always paranoid, and although he'd spared their lives, he was still suspicious of both Julian and his half-brother Gallus, and so he had them imprisoned on a royal estate in Cappadocia called Macellum, which simply means the enclosure. Now, this was actually a lot better than it sounds, since the estate was in fact a luxurious palace with extensive gardens. However, Julian later said that from the age of 12 to 18, he was basically imprisoned there, unable to meet anyone his own age or any of the friends he had met in Bithynia. He and Gallus were supervised by royal eunuchs who were responsible for giving the boys a Christian education, and otherwise they were left to just being, well, bored teenagers. Except for Julian, because the one activity he was not denied was reading books. And at Macellum he was able to acquire a vast library of books, with the emphasis, of course, on Christian texts, but also including all the major works of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy and literature. For him, this was a sort of paradise. And it wasn't long before he started to teach the royal tutors themselves, who were astonished by his intellectual abilities. In AD 348, when he was 17, he was released from Macellum and allowed to study at Nicomedia. Meanwhile, Gallus was called to the imperial court at Constantinople. But this didn't stop Julian continuing his studies at Pergamum and then at Athens, which was still the great centre of pagan philosophy and civilization, even though Christianity was increasingly intolerant of pagans. At Eleusis, just outside Athens, Julian was initiated into the Eleusinian mysteries, which involved 9 days of rituals that still remain a mystery to us today, since the initiates had to take a vow of silence, and rather surprisingly, no one ever publicly divulged what was involved, or if they did, at least no record of what they said has survived. And it was in these years that Julian himself later said that he was fully converted to paganism. But there was also no indication whatsoever in these years that Julian saw himself as a future emperor. When he was at Athens, he was described by a church father who met him, called Gregory of Nazianzus, as a bookish young man, withdrawn and totally unworldly. Some scholars have wondered whether he purposefully cultivated an eccentric personality in order to make himself less threatening to Constantius. For example, most famously, the Emperor Claudius had done exactly this in the 1st century AD, when, according to Suetonius, he appeared to be a slobbering fool in his youth, making people believe he was completely harmless and therefore less of a threat. If this was Julian's intention, it certainly worked, for Constantius seems to have dismissed him as an idiot, and he was allowed to pursue his intellectual interests undisturbed. Not so his half-brother Gallus, who, as you heard in the last episode, was given an important posting by Constantius in 351 to oversee the eastern provinces while he fought Magnentius in the west. And you'll remember what happened to Gallus. He was executed after succumbing to the temptations of corruption in 354. This meant that Julian was Constantius's only surviving male relative. But even this didn't make him feel safe. For when Gallus had been summoned by Constantius to Milan to explain his misrule, Julian too had been summoned from Athens. And he was held a virtual prisoner there for several days, fearing for his life, until he suddenly received very unexpected news. He was to be made Caesar. So that was the rank below Constantius, who was an Augustus, and sent to Gaul to sort out the collapsing frontier with the German tribes. So you might well ask, what on earth had happened? What was it that made Constantius decide suddenly to take Julian seriously and entrust him with an important post? Well, one answer is that he wanted someone who he thought he could trust to serve as a figurehead in the West. You heard in the previous episode how disastrous it was when Magnentius had seized the Western throne in 350, leading to a civil war and the Battle of Mursa Major in 351, which was one of the bloodiest battles fought between two Roman armies in Rome's entire history. In addition, what probably directly prompted Constantius to appoint Julian was another revolt in the west, this time led by a general called Silvanus, who you may recall had actually deserted Magnentius at the Battle of Mursa Major to join Constantius, which may well have been decisive in securing victory for Constantius. However, Silvanus clearly felt inadequately rewarded, for he proclaimed himself emperor in August 355 in Cologne, only to be killed by his own soldiers 28 days later, who clearly didn't share his ambition. This was very fortunate for Constantius, and to help avoid more rebellions like this in the West, he issued the order for Julian's promotion in November the same year. Another reason for Julian's appointment was the support given to him by Constantius's wife, Eusebia. This is a particularly interesting relationship because in his copious writings, Julian describes her in eulogistic terms. She had married Constantius after his first wife died in 350 and is said to have been exceptionally clever and beautiful. She exerted a powerful influence on Constantius, and she had met Julian a few years before, and again, according to Julian himself, it was she who had persuaded Constantius to allow him to spend time studying in Athens, and then again, Julian recorded that it was Eusebia who persuaded Constantius to make him Caesar. Historians have speculated whether Julian and Eusebia were having an affair, but there's no evidence of that, and it genuinely seems that she just thought he was a capable young man who her husband could trust. As we will find out, she was certainly correct on the first point, but less so on the second. So, on the 6th of November 355, Julian found himself standing on a rostrum surrounded by soldiers and standards as Constantius announced his elevation to Caesar and put a purple cloak around his shoulders. Observers have recorded that Julian looked downcast rather than elated. As part of the conversion to his new life, he was given Constantius's own unmarried sister, Helena, to marry. Unfortunately, Julian has left few kind words about her, suggesting the marriage was far from a love match. Helena was to die 5 years later in 360, although the cause has never been ascertained. However, Ammianus Marcellinus, our main source, says that she had 2 miscarriages and even suggests that Constantius's wife, Eusebia, was instrumental in making these happen by sending her midwives who gave her poison. His allegation is that Eusebia was jealous of Helena, which provides further substance to the idea that Julian and Eusebia were in love with each other. And I think this does seem likely from the evidence, although we'll never know for sure. However, what we do know for certain is that Julian was dispatched to Gaul in 355, and there he found a desperate situation. The problem was that the Franks and Alemanni had crossed the Rhine and occupied much of the west bank during the years between 351 and 355, when Magnentius had rebelled against Constantius. Indeed, Constantius had even invited them to do this in order to divert Magnentius's troops, most of whom had been withdrawn to fight Constantius. Now, the problem was that once the Germans had crossed the Rhine, they wouldn't go back, even though Constantius had urged them to respect the previous frontier after he'd defeated Magnentius. Indeed, the Franks had captured the important fortress city of Cologne in November 355, when Julian was just about to be made Caesar. So what could Julian, this bookish and introverted young man who looked completely the opposite of a soldier, do in this military crisis? To make matters even worse, Julian himself and the historian Ammianus, who served, of course, in Julian's army and was a great fan of Julian's, say that Constantius denied him any real authority and made him subordinate to the Roman generals who were already in Gaul. But what then happened was a surprise to everyone, for the bookish Julian showed that he was an outstanding general. So let's look at the background to the war in Gaul. The first point was that Constantius wanted to recover the west bank of the Rhine from the Germans. To do this, he envisaged a pincer movement on the Germans, with the Roman army based in Milan advancing through Switzerland and into southern Germany. Meanwhile, the Roman army in Gaul, led not by Julian but by the main Roman general Marcellus, was to advance into Alsace, and the two armies were to meet at Strasbourg. Now, what actually happened was that both Constantius and Marcellus made slow progress with the bulk of the Roman troops. And to everyone's surprise, it was Julian who, leading a much smaller Roman force north of Marcellus's army, achieved some startling successes. So, how did Julian suddenly become a successful soldier? Well, on his way to Gaul, Julian himself says that he studied Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, in which he described his conquest of Gaul. Julian used this to make himself an expert in military tactics, as well as immediately winning the respect of his officers and men through his bravery and insistence on sharing all the hardships of warfare with his men. In particular, a senior Gaulish officer called Salutius Secundus became his trusted second-in-command, and thereafter a lifelong friend. Julian organised hit-and-run guerrilla-type tactics with his Roman soldiers that completely outwitted the Germans and sent them reeling back to the Rhine. He beat them off from besieging Autun, recovered Cologne, and repelled a major German attack on the city of Sens. And he did all of this with a relatively small number of men and no help at all from his senior general Marcellus, who became so jealous of Julian's success that he actually refused to help him repel the attack on Sens. In fact, it didn't matter, since Julian's tactics and the die-hard loyalty he was earning from his troops were more than a match for the Germans. Even Constantius was impressed. He sacked Marcellus for not supporting Julian, despite the latter's protests that Julian was conspiring against the emperor. For once, Constantius's paranoia gave way to genuine admiration for Julian. He promoted him to commander-in-chief in Gaul, and Julian, in his turn, appointed an exceptionally experienced and highly regarded career soldier called Severus as his senior general. It would turn out to be a superb appointment. But Julian could not prevent Constantius appointing a much less capable commander called Barbatio to lead the Roman troops in northern Italy. Like Marcellus, Barbatio was intensely jealous of Julian. In 357, Julian began a second offensive to expel the Germans from the west bank of the Rhine. But while he and Severus advanced into Alsace, Barbatio was halted by the Alemanni in northern Switzerland. They then broke through his ranks and attacked Lugdunum, that's modern Lyon, but failed to capture it, and it was Julian's troops who forced them to retreat. Indeed, along the entire Alsatian front, Julian was forcing the Germans back. In contrast, Barbatio was making no progress and refused to help Julian, even burning his boats on the Rhine, rather than send them to Julian to help his men cross the river. In fact, this did not matter, since Julian's soldiers, acting as lightly armed commandos, forded the Rhine, captured the islands in the river from the Germans, and crossed over. Meanwhile, Constantius was frustrated by Barbatio's lack of success. He ordered him to cross the Rhine. The result was a disaster. The pontoon bridge put across the river by Barbatio's men was smashed by trees the Germans floated downstream. Then they attacked the Romans and sent them reeling back towards Italy. Worse news was to follow. As Julian and Severus achieved their objectives, they heard that a massive German army, said to be 35,000 strong, with a host of tribes uniting against the Romans, was heading towards Strasbourg, intending to conquer all of Gaul. Against them, Julian had only about 13,000 soldiers. He was about to face his greatest test so far. The Battle of Strasbourg was about to be fought. And that ends this episode. Thanks so much for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, of course, I'd be delighted for any ratings or reviews in whichever podcast app you use. And in the next episode, we'll continue with one of the most famous battles in all of Roman history, the Battle of Strasbourg. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.